Good morning for those joining in the United States and the Americas. Good afternoon to those of you joining from across the Atlantic. My name is Graham Brookie. I'm the director and managing editor of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council, and I have the pleasure of introducing you to an important conversation, protecting truth, disinformation in times of crisis. This conversation is hosted as part of 360 StratCom, the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab's premier government-to-government forum that brings together allies and partners to discuss how we can better work together to mitigate the threats of online harms and posed to democratic institutions here in the digital age. Before we get started, I want to thank our partners who are supporting this program, the United States Mission to the European Union, the United Kingdom's Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, the Embassy of the Republic of Lithuania to the United States, and the Global Engagement Center at the U.S. Department of State. For today's conversation, I'm honored to introduce Alex Aiken, the Executive Director for Government Communications for the United Kingdom. When we talk about full of government approaches to communications, many times that means a number of different people in any number of governments. In the UK's example, it means Alex. So we're honored to have Alex joining from his office at 10 Downing, where he is responsible and has just had a number of meetings throughout the day today on exactly what we're talking about. We're also delighted to welcome Ms. Amy McKinnon, who is an award-winning reporter covering national security and intelligence at Foreign Policy, who will be guiding today's conversation. Amy is one of the best on both of these kind of dual issues of how a global competition for information fits into our day-to-day lives, as well as how disinformation kind of spreads around the world. So in 2020, the COVID pandemic, democratic protests, contested electoral outcomes, the outbreak of armed conflict have strained the resilience of civic debate and, frankly, the shared set of facts that democracy depends on. In institutions around the world. So in times of crisis, which for us at the DFR Lab, when we're looking at times of crisis, they're high information events. And it includes a lot of good information that spreads out there, but also a lot of false or bad information, manipulated content, divisive narratives, spread by hostile actors, domestic or foreign, to manipulate the information environment. That plays out around the world. It also plays out in hyper-local situations. So today, Alex and Amy will discuss the role of governments and public institutions have in responding to disinformation campaigns and in communicating with broader populations in times of crisis. And so with that, I want to thank you again for joining, and I will pass to Amy.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Graham. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak with Mr. Aiken today. Before we begin, I just want to remind our audience that you can submit your questions for Mr. Aiken using the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm hoping that to make today's conversation as interactive and as engaging as possible. So please do send in your questions and we'll get to them in the second half of the discussion. So I don't want to delay any further because I think it would be an understatement to say that you've had a busy year, Alex. So let's dive in. I'm hoping you can start with giving us the kind of 10,000-foot view because government crisis management communications is not new by any stretch of the imagination, and neither is disinformation by foreign states. I mean, this is something that's gone on certainly since the Cold War, but even before that. But I'm hoping you can unpack for us a little bit, how has the internet and the digital age affected the challenges that you face in your job?
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Graham, as well. It's a delight to be on the programme. So in my office, I have a memo, a government published memo that warns on the dangers of disinformation and how it can divide people and information that will lead people to the wrong conclusions and so on, issued by the government in the United Kingdom. And the date on the memo is 1680. And certainly back to the birth of that evil device, the printing press, that caused a one-to-many form of communication to be many-to-many. And in a sense, the growth of the internet only replicates that experience in pre-modern times. Also, as part of the run of meetings I've had this morning, we had our cross-government economy group, and we were talking about how we are going to implement and communicate the Prime Minister Johnson's desire to build back better after the crisis, which ironically and perhaps helpfully also mirrors the argument that President-elect Biden has made in the United States. And I am clear that that narrative, that story we want to tell about how we're going to recover as a country from the crisis and the government will invest in infrastructure and level up the United Kingdom and help people back on their feet is really important, because that is the best antidote to disinformation, to the sort of things that seek to divide and damage our society. And I think it's important at the start to point out that my main concern is about disinformation, sometimes often caused by hostile states, sometimes by other malign groups. We could talk about Skirple, we could talk about 5G conspiracies and other things and so on. We also here deal with misinformation, which is the misinterpretation and genuine and honest mistakes that are sometimes made by people. I know on this call there is amongst the audience there's a security expert called Hugo Rosemont, a friend of mine who joined my football or soccer club because he claimed to be a great footballer. He's not a great footballer, he's terrible. He's a lovely man, of course, but that is misinformation, and that's the sort of thing we can cope with. But dealing with disinformation, things that undermine our society, is something that I think the UK government, working with others, certainly Graham mentioned the State Department, the Global Engagement Centre, have been an essential partner in this, and the government of Lithuania, Rytis Paulinas, the Director of Comms at the Ministry, Foreign Affairs Ministry. Globally, if we work together, if the democracies work together, we can defeat disinformation and learn from each other.
So if I understand correctly, you were appointed to your role in 2012. So
yes,
you've been at this for a while now. I'm hoping, as this is StratCom, and we're hoping to give our audience some kind of practical takeaways from today. Could you talk us through a disinformation effective crisis that you've managed during your time in government, and just walk us through the anatomy of how that unfolded and the role that disinformation played in shaping the event and the government's response?
Yes, certainly, Amy. And as Graham said, I'm happy to take questions and challenge. And I hope I will leave with a few ideas from the august members of the audience. But let's pick one that is familiar to many, and where the countries I mentioned and many others were very supportive of the United Kingdom, which is the attempted assassination of the Skirples in Salisbury a couple of years ago. It feels like ancient history now, but I remember first, in terms of practical tips, this extraordinary story that started on a Sunday afternoon with news being broadcast, two people who were found foaming at the mouth on a park bench in an English country city. And that was weird, and as we gathered, because we thought it might be some sort of flu or illness, although it quickly became apparent they had been poisoned, there was a sense, the practical thing I would draw from that is that I was there as the government's chief communicator throughout all those discussions. And if you don't have the senior communicator in the room, then they can't advise and can't help shape the direction of policy, and certainly advise on what policies will work to influence public behaviour for good or not. It quickly became apparent that it was an attempted assassination, and the security and intelligence agencies could confirm that to us. But moving forward, some of the lessons I would draw from that is, one, it will be well known to people on this call that the Russian state delivered 40 different explanations of how the Skirples came to be poisoned. It was the fault of the European Union, it was a plot by the British government, they were food poisoned, even it was the ghost of Margaret Thatcher. And it was fascinating to see that argument, which Peter Perotsov has put very clearly in his book about Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, how they tried to cloud the environment. I think it's also worth reflecting with colleagues about what we did about that and why I think what we did worked. First, as a democracy and governed by the rule of law, we had to be clear on our facts. And it took us 13 days to establish the facts in a way that were publishable, because this involved declassifying information, checking the facts, talking to allies, and building a coalition who would support our conclusion, to be able to say publicly that this was an attempted assassination which originated with the Russian state. We knew that because we knew they'd been testing Novichok on door handles, and then we went out with the news. As a point of professional craft, it may entertain people that we released the news and the facts of our case 5 minutes after the start of the Russian ambassador's daily press conference in London, where he promoted his 40 different explanations. And as we tipped off the broadcasters and the press conference went straight to air, you could see the journalists react as their phones pinged with news that the British government had released its dossier. And you could see that then the questions poured in, and it completely undermined the case the ambassador was seeking to make. We also released the case as a letter from the then National Security Advisor, Lord Sedwill, to the Secretary General of NATO, which reinforced the point about the use of alliances. And indeed, Mark went to Brussels to meet and brief NATO. So there is more to that story I'm happy to tell, but I hope that is helpful in terms of the response and establishing the facts and the communications role, then a little bit of creativity in how you deploy your arguments.
So you mentioned there that the Russians had these 40 explanations for what had gone on. And I think for me, that's often one of the key distinctions between propaganda versus disinformation, that propaganda attempts to persuade people of one version of one worldview, version of the truth, whereas disinformation is, as I think it was a Rand report once described, the fire hose of falsehoods. From a government communications perspective, how do you deal with that when you're not dealing with, in the Cold War era, one narrative, one vision, but you're now dealing with just 40 different versions, all kind of varying degrees of,
We're ever vigilant, and we try and understand how those who oppose our way of life and seek to undermine our societies or steal our economic secrets, their mode of operation. So we do look through the output from other states, and we do analyse what effect it's designed to have, and whether it works. I mean, I've been an avid viewer of RT when indeed it was Russia Today, and you can see transparently what it's trying to achieve. And we also know, because I think the second part to my answer to your good question is to say that we do on a daily 24/7 the digital, of course the traditional media, but fundamentally the digital analysis of what effect that sort of disinformation or hardline propaganda has. And certainly in the case of RT, I'm pretty confident that it talks to a particular segment of British society, perhaps around 40,000 or so people. I'm a bit more concerned when they try and influence people I regard as vulnerable groups, and take them on a path to radicalism or indeed extremism. And that's where we look to intervene with counter-brand rather than counter-narrative campaigns, things that are encompassed now defending democracy strand of work. But within the Cabinet Office number 10 communications team, our rapid response unit are the main front line for finding, assessing, considering, and then responding. Sometimes strategic silence, if the thing actually has no legs in the way I described the RT work, is important. Sometimes we respond directly, sometimes we respond through trusted partners. But I think that front line is the essential first line to our approach to tackling disinformation.
I'm wondering now if you can explain for our audience talk to us about the RESIST framework. What is it? How did it come about? And now that it's in place, is there anything that you would change about it?
Yes, look, that's a very good question, Amy. And look, there are two things here. I talked about the British government warning from the 17th century. I also, having read Thomas Rind's excellent book on disinformation and propaganda during the 20th and early 21st century, the great story of how the AIDS comes from the CIA, originated in fact in India. us continuing to learn and understand is absolutely critical. We do that through Resist. We have copies of the Resist framework can be downloaded from the Government Communication Service website. We'll put the address in the chat for you. But I think as a public servant, I sat down and I read as many things as I could. I discovered from the archives the work of the International Research Department, who were a component of the British Foreign Office from the 1940s, that once produced about half the television output of Mexico to help stop Mexico going communist. And it was a story I never knew. And I read all this stuff and I thought, we almost know too much in the 21st century. And I've got to find a way with my colleagues of summarising and bringing together the best elements of that into an operational model that people can actually deploy. And that was the origins of Resist. And then I think crucially, we talked to some very fine academics, some at the University of Stockholm in Sweden and elsewhere. I said, all right, how do you find it? So historical experience, current practitioner work from my perspective, academic input, and then, again, the creative element, coming up with a mnemonic, Resist, that people might not be able to remember what every letter stands for, but it's there in black and white. And certainly, if I think about the work of the Government Communication Service, one of the powerful things we've ever done is saying that your work should be Oasis. Every campaign should have an objective, audience, strategy, implementation, and scoring for evaluation. That puts people in a mindset about thinking logically through the problem. Much of public service, and indeed private sector communication, is too creative and not enough science based. So Resist is designed to be a logical, evidence, somewhat scientific model for people to action, because as a practitioner, we're in the business of acting. We deal with about 70 cases of mis and disinformation each week in the rapid response team. Many of them relatively harmless, but if they're allowed to build, and in the absence of your own strong story as a government or a public service organisation, they can undermine that fact-based, rational debate that we seek.
Thank you for that. And I think I just saw that Graham has put that in the chat box for anyone who's watching and is interested in following up on the Resist framework. I now want to turn to talk about this year. I mean, obviously the pandemic has been just uncalculable global challenge, and for Britain, the biggest challenge faced since World War II. And from a government communications perspective, I mean, what has this year been like for you when you're contending both with, you know, communicating to the public about safety measures, which can have life or death consequences if implemented or not, but also the dual challenge of the so-called infodemic, the just mass disinformation about the virus and its cause and its spread. Just talk us through just what has this year been like for you?
It's been hard, Amy. It's been very sad at times, and it's also been disheartening. And we've tried our best as public servants to support the national effort, which has primarily been the responsibility of our National Health Service, but the brilliant work of scientists that led to the initial rollout of the first vaccine. I hope the first of many shows some hope. I think turning to the contribution that communications can deliver, the thing I'm proudest of this year is that our Secretary of State for Health said on national television that the communications effort has demonstrably saved lives. And there was a recent study from Oxford University that said that the rollout of the vaccine, we managed to the rollout of the NHS app, which is the mobile phone app, allows people to track and trace and do all sorts of clever things. We've got 20 million downloads of that app through effective marketing and promotion, through the quality of the app itself. And Oxford University said that will save over time up to 7,000 lives. So there's a story there about the importance of communications, going back to my point about all this talk and action on counter disinformation is useless unless the communication function is properly plugged into the wider organisation. So I vividly remember a meeting we had with the Prime Minister on the 28th of February, which was one of many, and it certainly wasn't the first meeting we had with the PM at this, but that was the point that we realised that we were going to be in this for a long time and we needed to significantly increase our communications effort. So practically the first thing we did the following week was we created the cross-government communications hub to manage the communications effort on COVID. And that is important because within that hub, we had civil servants, we had people from local government, we had people seconded in from international trade, economic ministries, Public Health England, the NHS, and the armed forces. And I'll come to them in a moment. But that enabled us to put together a communications effort, essentially a war room that could both do the proactive communications on public health, could do the communication to businesses, could support communities, could deal with the things that came up over the period, like panic buying in supermarkets, and could help tackle disinformation. And I think one of the crucial decisions we made that in a lot of our national security meetings, I sit and chat to the people in our armed forces who are an essential part of the response to the crisis. But because the UK government has that join up, it wasn't a surprise when they said to me, look, we understand the communications pressure you're under. Can we provide some people from the Army's 77 Brigade, the information warfare team, to support you specifically in countering disinformation from hostile states? Not on the general piece, but specifically on that area. And I said yes to that. And they were an essential part of the hub, which means you've got a full spectrum response and you can deal with it, and everyone understands what each part of the organisation is doing. And I said the year had been hard, and one of the things that the Army did when they were with us, recognising that it was tough and people were working 7 days in a row for weeks on end, they did some really great work as soldiers to explain what it's like in combat and how you manage your mental health and your well-being under that extremely stressful situation, which was nothing like the stress that we faced, but was an interesting example about the magic happens when public services work together for the general good.
So you mentioned there that part of their role was combating disinformation from foreign states. I'm wondering if you can just expand on what disinformation you've seen from foreign actors around the pandemic, particularly.
Yes, and you will forgive me if I protect some of the guilty partners, guilty parties, but one of the things that most worried us early on was the great 5G conspiracy, which had practical real-world effects around the burning down of electricity masts and the injuries that could happen to people. And we can speculate, and I have some very clear ideas about people who were pushing that. But nevertheless, intervening in that and just walking you through how that was done in terms of spotting the sources that came from, assessing the likely impact, tracking its amplification, producing the material, using the resist framework to combat it, talking to community groups directly, in particular localities. And then I work with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who in the UK are the ministry who liaises directly with the big internet service providers, with Google and with Facebook, who did rise to this challenge and acted more quickly than I have seen them do in previous crises to address the problems that we face. So that was one thing. Disinformation about the effectiveness of vaccines. And again, we saw some sources that sought to discredit the development of the vaccines, which we clamped down on very hard, using trusted messengers, scientists and medics. Then, as the Times have reported, a variant on that, which, as it's been publicly reported, has been attributed to at least part of the Russian state, whereby the Russian state appeared to want to run a campaign to claim that the UK vaccines had been trialled on monkeys and therefore implicitly could turn you into some sort of animal if you took them. It was pretty cack-handed, and honestly, a lot of this stuff we are not really impressed with. But then, in a sense, they're not trying to impress us. They're trying to generate a viral impact that will discredit our institutions. And I think, finally, one of the things we have been watching is the great battle for vaccine supremacy between Russia and China, particularly aimed at countries in Africa. Obviously, it's a diplomatic battle through the lens of their perceived medical superiority. But it's been interesting for us that the way that Russia generates disinformation and tries to undermine other countries' vaccines has come back to haunt them, because the figures that we have seen suggest there's less support for vaccines in Russia and less confidence in the vaccine produced by their own government, because the Russian government is always saying vaccines that are produced might not be good for you. Nothing is true and everything is possible, you might say.
As you rightly mentioned, I mean, a lot of Russian disinformation is pretty cack-handed. It's kind of hastily slapped together and is not terribly convincing. And yet, some people believe it and share it on social media, and it may eventually affect their behavior. And something I've always what I feel is for me is an unresolved question when it comes to disinformation is, well, these aren't persuasive narratives, but still people are buying them, they're believing them. So what's the role of government communications in making people less susceptible to these narratives? And where does the line stop? I mean, does that stray into is that other agencies' responsibilities? Is that more of an education question? Does that require a whole of government response to that? How do you stop people believing these clumsy narratives?
So a few months ago, I was pouring people coffee in this room and listening to their wise words. There was an army brigadier, there was a public health expert, there was a data scientist, a behavioural scientist, a chief executive of a private sector communications agency, and a couple of civil servants. And I think the magic happens when you get that sort of expertise in the room discussing these sorts of problems and bringing their different perspectives to bear. On the table at our national security meetings is the Chilcot rules, which are the rules we established after the so-called dodgy dossier that led to the UK Parliament believing things that led to the invasion of Iraq that may have not been entirely true. And part of what we are taught as public servants is test, but verify, bring evidence to the room, bring competing viewpoints into the discussion, and don't just develop a consensus. So that discussion over coffee with those views, some of which were quite robustly opposed, is where you need to have people who can critically examine how far is this a problem, if it's a problem at all, and what's the clever way to deal with it. I remember a conversation I had with the British Army's Imam, the senior Muslim in the British Army, who said, look, in many societies, the messenger is more powerful than the message. So thinking through those techniques about how you want to approach the problem. Sometimes, as I said, a strategic silence is the right thing. What we do have, as I think I've just highlighted, we have the data scientists, we have the behavioural experts, we have the researchers, we have large quantities of quant and qual research. That's great. That provides us with a whole view of national and to some extent international opinion, but analysing that and doing the hard yards, and what does this tell us? What is the insight? And what is our hypothesis and our theory of change? And from that, identifying, I mentioned at the start around RT, there are certain groups who may be more susceptible to others. Let's, for instance, pick a hypothetical group, young men from a black minority ethnic community, and then thinking through, it's not the whole population, but how do we reach and talk to them in a way that will reassure them and provide them with a slightly different worldview. And that's certainly where, as you said, Amy, at the start of this conversation, the internet and the filter bubbles that it creates are a problem. I feel we have to address the problem rather than wish it away.
And before I continue, I just want to remind our audience that they can submit their questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll get to them in just a second. Earlier this year, you unveiled a new communication strategy, which was characterized by moving away from the kind of traditional gatekeepers of using the media as intermediaries to communicating with the public more directly through the UK is now going to do televised briefings, the way that we're used to here in the US with the White House briefings, and more use of social media. Can you talk through the thinking behind that decision and what prompted it?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm very fortunate in that the UK Government Communications Service spends probably close to $1 billion a year on 144 major campaigns and employs 7,000 people in terms of full-time equivalents. we're a big organisation, but that is the value and trust that senior officials and politicians place in the power of communications to do good, which I can illustrate through our public health campaigns or public recruitment. But before I had this role, I worked for a local authority in Westminster, in London. And I fundamentally believe that you can scale up or scale down the models that I'm talking about. And indeed, we've seen some brilliant work from local governments to counter disinformation during the current pandemic. When I arrived in 2012, a lot of government communications in the UK had been closed down. About 3,000 people had lost their jobs. And that was because they couldn't prove their value. And in the aftermath of the financial crisis and the period of austerity, government was cutting back on things and said, look, if we can't show the value of what government communications is achieving, we're basically going to cut it in half. So it's always been a mission of mine to make sure we prove the value of what we do. And we're obsessive about the inputs, the outputs, the outtakes, and the outcomes. So 3 times a week, I get the COVID communications dashboard that looks at the quant poll measures, the web measures, the trends on social media and so on. But communications doesn't stand still, and there is a danger in any institution, particularly a government institution, that you're happy with the familiar rather than thinking about how you innovate. And I, as head of profession, my job has 3 parts: government communication strategy, the joint leadership of the Cabinet Office number 10 communications team, and then as head of profession, my job is to identify best practice and make that the standard in what we do. And I'll nick ideas from the United States or from Denmark or Lithuania and many other countries in a spirit of cooperation to achieve that. But certainly, I recognised early on in the crisis that our traditional channels, very good digital channels, very good media channels, cranking up the marketing campaign, it was clear that actually the image that came to my mind was the televised briefings we had during the Falklands War in 1981, when I was very young. But thinking back, that was a thing that fast and effectively got the message of reassurance and transparency across to people, the opposite of the tactics of disinformation. This is 2020, so we could do it differently, and we put the Prime Minister, he agreed to do the daily press briefings. A number of things surprised us. First, we were surprised that people tuned in, up to 30 million, so half the British population on occasions, or big occasions, regularly 4 to 5 million people, and that worked. But you can't be happy with that. You've got to think, well, how do we adapt, and how do we explain and reassure people the government has a plan and counteract disinformation? So the next thing we brought in was public data. Now, I'm not an expert on that. I would commend David Spiegelhalter's excellent book. I think it's called The Art of Statistics, as a crash course in that. But understanding if you're going to present data, you've got to present it in a truthful, honest and clear way. It's more difficult than it seems. And we got a group of data scientists in from our Office for National Statistics, and some of their material was used to counter disinformation. But we put alongside the Prime Minister the public data up, the graphs, the increase, and then in due course the decrease in the virus. And that was important. Then we thought, well, this is very good. We're holding these daily press briefings and lots of journalists are asking questions. We didn't notice, as we watched the viewership figures, that people would tune in for the Prime Minister and the medical and scientific experts that flanked him. When the journalists started asking questions, we saw a drop-off in viewership. The public wanted to hear from the principals, but were less interested in the political debate. Then I said, well, look, why don't we get the public to ask questions? Now, we can't get the public to come into the room because it wouldn't be secure, and how could we manage it? But again, we were surprised, and this was learning for us, that when we put on gov.uk, which is the single web platform for the UK government, do you want to ask the Prime Minister something? We thought we might get a couple of thousand questions. In the end, when we paused the position in July, we'd had over 500,000. And 2 or 3 of those questions were asked to the Prime Minister and the other experts at every press conference. They weren't told in advance. We got a research company to pick at random the questions based on their analysis of the questions that were being asked. And that was important. That was an important measure of reassuring and trust. And then, of course, if you've got 500,000 questions, you can see what the public are asking about. And for example, the public were far more concerned about schools and opening and the safety of schools than they were about some of the questions the journalists were quite legitimately asking. But there were two agendas going on here which allowed us to shape the policy and use that data to shape what we were doing. And that was the genesis of the decision to move on to the US model, and other countries as diverse as Japan and Germany also do televised daily briefings. It's not a new idea, I'm sure that they do them very effectively, but to move, as we will from January, to televised daily briefings through the Prime Minister's new press spokeswoman, Allegra Stratton. So that is an innovation that the crisis has enabled and caused.
What do you see as being the role of traditional media in times of crisis, and particularly when it comes to countering disinformation?
Well, thank you for asking that, Amy. It is more valuable than many of us had supposed. So we, a natural crisis, people are dying, and I think I should share with colleagues, when you're sitting in the room with the senior decision makers and you realise that you could run out of PPE, the hospitals could overflow, what that might mean in terms of public order, the opportunities that creates for our adversaries to sow discord, is pretty scary. And you've got to have the best data and the best advice and strong-minded leaders, as we have in the UK, to make the right decisions. But you also realise that you've got to have a communication strategy that passes the Heineken test, reaches the parts that other strategies do not reach. So we were fairly sort of Catholic in using every channel. We looked at newspapers and we talked to the newspaper industry, of course, made the case for newspaper advertising, and we reached agreement with them, something called the Press Partnership, where they would write and place in every daily, national and regional newspaper, so about 500 newspapers all told, public information about how to respond and deal with the crisis, both in terms of how to support businesses, schemes to help businesses, public health information, and so on. And we've run that campaign since, I think, last May, and it's still going on. The interesting point is, when we've done the research on what channels people trust and use, the newspaper channels are about the same level as the digital channels. We've delivered about 750 million impressions, 750 million pieces of social media content, films from scientists, pieces on TikTok aimed at persuading young people to do the right thing, 750 million of those. But digital media and newspapers, about the same level of trust and reach. Newspapers slightly more trusted, but about the same level of reach, which was interesting. Who knew that newspapers still worked? On the editorial side, I mean, it was very evident. A number of senior journalists approached me at the start of the pandemic and said, we're going to do the right thing. And largely they have done. But this has also been a big hit in terms of traditional newspapers to their business model, which is sad. So there is a frustration with how the economic position is. In terms of broadcast media, the BBC is an ever more dominant player, but that is based on the quality of its broadcasting and the rigour of its approach. And they have engaged in the fact-checking and been quite careful in the way they've approached the pandemic. So I think journalists, alongside, I hope, public servants, and indeed the general public, can take credit for the general effort in beating the virus.
So I'm going to turn to audience questions now, and if people do want to submit their questions for Mr. Aiken, they can use the Q&A function in Zoom. The first question comes from Paul Ellis, who says, before we engage and communicate with our intended audiences, do we not have to first address the erosion of trust in official sources by the actions of political leaders, both at home and abroad?
I think that it's a good question from Paul, but the erosion of trust in terms of our international, in terms of our governments is slightly overdone. We use the RepTrak model in terms of polling members of the informed public about their trust in government, which uniformly gives us a benchmark against private sector organisations, and fundamentally government as a whole comes out at about the same level as an insurance company or a utility and energy provider, sort of big, boring, necessary, and slightly bureaucratic. And I think that is a fairer representation of the reputation of government than some things. And of course, within government, while we fly under the HMG, Her Majesty's Government logo, there are a number of brands. National Health Service is one of the most trusted brands in the world, and certainly in the UK. If you ask members of the public in the UK about what the Cabinet Office does, they probably wouldn't have much of an idea. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, his social media channels, we calculated the other day, can reach 15 million people in one go across all the channels, and we know the engagement, the people's question time that we created is hugely important. But clearly, Paul's right. There are varying levels of trust. I think the trust is related to what people say and then do. And as long as you can keep that say-do gap narrow, and all our lives, sometimes we promise things we can't always deliver, you're going to retain the benefit of the doubt, the license to operate, and public goodwill. I mean, to illustrate that, the polling on the belief that the UK government is doing the right thing over the course of the crisis has seesawed between 80% and 20%. That is understandable when you're trying to do difficult things at a time when people are losing their lives and livelihoods. But we don't ignore that. We think every day about how we can build and maintain that trust. And certainly my advice as a senior communicator, as I've had the privilege of working for 4 prime ministers, is always to say, what is your destination? Let's look at how we can achieve that. And honesty, transparency, and as a public servant, my job is to promote, explain, and justify our policies. It's not to attack or dissemble or indeed lie. So I think that code that we abide by is an important defence and an important builder of trust.
Thank you for that. And we have another question, a very good one from JJ Johnson, who says, I wonder if you could provide some perspective on efforts of the UK to combat disinformation by educating citizens on media literacy. And if so, are these efforts part of the school curriculum for children?
I'm not. I have a lovely wife and 2 horrible children. I will ask the horrible children whether they are educated in media literacy. They certainly have robust opinions on most things. I think, look, my chatting to my daughter who's 16, social media is something I am glad I didn't grow up with, and I think that is a thing, and that's less about media literacy than the nature of modern society. But one of the things we do in the Cabinet Office is we have the Don't Feed the Beast campaign. You can find details of that online, which is specifically aimed at people like my daughter and other young people, 18 to 24-year-olds, to talk to them about don't trust everything that you see online, and check the source and think about why people are doing it. I'm sure media literacy is taught through civics and history and politics in schools, but that's the government contribution. We've been, as a government, really proud of the work that we do with the World Health Organization and with others. I mentioned the State Department, but with the WHO, we created alongside Cambridge University the inoculation game, which is an online game that's designed to teach people about how they can post disinformation and why that's a bad thing, and what they can do about it. And the final point I would make is that I think yesterday we had, the UK helped host the Media Freedoms Conference, built on an initiative we started a couple of years ago. And that media freedom work, that global work, is an important way to make sure that we do have a free and active and questioning media to help keep politicians and governments on the straight and narrow. Thank you.
So we have a related question on the issue of social media, which comes in from Jake Passner. Jake asks, given the rapid availability of flashy information in the modern age, how does the government lend authenticity to messages across platforms when a large portion of society no longer trusts the media?
Look, it's a very good question, and it deserves a much longer and better answer than I'm going to be able to give. My default position would always be go human. in that a human response with a real human being who is sympathetic and thoughtful about the issues that we face is going to accrue the reputational credit that will make people understand what's going on. The UK Health Minister, Matt Hancock, is a hero of mine. He has been the health minister throughout this crisis. He's done more interviews than probably politicians in many countries would do in a lifetime. He was criticised on social media for briefly crying about the launch of the vaccine on television. It's not something I expected him to do. I genuinely believe it was a human moment, that this man has led the health system through an extraordinary crisis, and he criticised every day, and he's just bloody pleased that we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I think that's a good example. There's a lot more I could say. The public data and the trust in statistics and verifiable statistics that people understand. There's also an excellent article that was recently in Nature magazine, and we'll send you the details for it, written by a group of scientists, including, I think, David Spiegelhalter, that said it's okay to say to people, we don't know. There is a degree of uncertainty. Any course on COVID will kill some people or end other people's businesses. So we've got to balance things. And I think, in answer to that, to the good question, I think accepting that we don't have all the answers, which is the 20th century model of command and control was very much about we are omnipotent, is something that the COVID crisis will change for good.
And staying on the topic of media, I'm going to throw in my own question here. How important has it been for the UK having the BBC, having a central public broadcaster which is trusted, which is, you know, a major news source for most of the country? How has that helped to get the message out to the public about responding to the crisis?
The BBC are a central and important element, and absolutely the top media source. But if you take the city of Liverpool, where led by the local government, supported by central government, and indeed with the deployment of the armed forces, they have significantly reduced the prevalence of the virus. The city has worked together, and the work the council has done, the work of the Liverpool Echo, which is the main, we used to say newspaper, but of course it's an online as well as printed publication, the work of independent television, has all contributed. And I know that the source you trust most is the person next to you. In my case, it would be my wife. In the case of the people of Liverpool, it would be the civic leaders of Liverpool, and then the region, and then you go up. So credible local messengers are most powerful, which is why the press partnership was important to us. So the BBC can give you global coverage, and the BBC World Service has helped us with the disinformation campaign, and through them we've reached, I think, about 750 million people at the last count, with the joint work we do with the WHO. But actually it's the credible local advocates who will persuade people to take the vaccine, to obey the injunction to hands, face, space, the core of our public health work, and actually help people not believe disinformation.
So back to our audience questions now. We have one which has come in. Going back to the kind of limitations of where the limitations lie of government communications. You know, what are those limitations? In what situations is the government an ineffective voice? I mean, you've spoken previously about sometimes when it's best to just not address a piece of disinformation at all. Where is that line for you?
Yeah, so Amy, my starting point is government communications properly and professionally deployed is a powerful force for good, to explain, to justify, to inform, and it can help save, enhance, and improve people's lives. But your questioner is right, there is a limit. There was a time in the UK government during the early 2000s when government decided it needed to comment on everything. Football matches, horse races, anything that moved. And I think my general finding from that is the more government speaks, the more people are concerned. If your government is having to say a lot, then people think there must be something wrong. And I know that when we dial down, in normal times, government communications, the polling ratings of the government as a whole go up because people think there's no problems. We're living through a pandemic, and therefore always on government communications is a necessity to reassure and change people's behaviour to do the right things, take the vaccine, for example. But in more normal times, government has to stick to what it's good at and provide the space for people to market, explain, debate, and so on. The things that I think we are particularly strong on are public health, business opportunity, and national security. Our national security agencies are probably the highest rated part of government outside the NHS. And people recognise if they get a message from National Security Agency, probably Britain's being, like many other countries on this call, conditioned by acts of terrorism, you respond to them quickly. And again, one of the things I'm proudest of is the public campaigns we've run that have got people to report suspicious acts that have turned into potential acts of terrorism, which the police, the security agencies, and the government communicators have therefore prevented from happening.
I think we have time for one more question. This comes from Hugo Rosemont. Hugo asks, how does the UK government communications see the importance of working with the private sector when it comes to crisis communications and disinformation?
Thank you, Hugo. We couldn't have gone through this crisis without colleagues who have supported us from the private sector and bring a different perspective into the room. The thing they don't have is the scale of work that we get through. I think that always surprises them, but the skills they bring from creativity, from data analysis. We use lots of private companies, and I think probably our spend on private agencies is in excess of £300 million a year. And I'm keen to make sure we broaden the use of them. A particular area they were particularly vital at the start of the campaign was research and analytics, quant and qual, where their work helped design our public health communication strategy. Amy, I'm happy to take a couple of quick ones if there's any more you want to flag, and I promise to give very short answers.
Sure. So I may go back to, let's go for some practical questions, I think, to hopefully give our audience some more takeaways from today's event. So quick fire round. What are the most common mistakes that you see or have experienced yourself when it comes to crisis communications?
Acting before you aren't in full possession of the facts. Get the picture straight and then act. Don't dive in.
Very quick fire. Okay, next up. What's the most frustrating or difficult thing you have dealt with encountering state-driven domestic disinformation?
Understanding and attributing the source, where sometimes there is a reluctance in government to call people out. My general view is that calling them out is usually a good deterrence effect. And when people try and overcomplicate it and saying you're just amplifying the disinformation, I think that's wrong. I think the pre-bunking and the inoculation is a much more powerful thing you can get from calling out.
And what are the differences in managing disinformation which is driven by foreign actors versus domestic disinformation? You know.
Yeah, the foreign actors are more determined, higher volume, and more consistent. It is easier over time to deal with the domestic issues, but certainly sitting here day after day, 7 o'clock each morning in the COVID hub, we did notice, using Resist, using the fact framework, using the good offices of government working together, the amount of disinformation, both domestic and foreign, over the period of the COVID crisis from February through to July diminished significantly. So I believe we were having a positive effect in clearing the way for a more rational, fact-based debate.
So we've got one more audience question, and I will make this our final question. Very practical one from Ben Heap. Ben asks, how do you communicate effectively in support of policy when policy changes so quickly or isn't fully developed?
I think communicators have got to understand the policy, got to help shape the policy. I think communicators have got to bring data into the room, which is why I made the point about digital media sentiment and polling. And I think that communicators need to be deeply interested in it. If they do that, they can advise a course of action that will shape a consistent, robust policy that will last over time.
Thank you for that. And I will leave it there. We are 1 minute under the hour, so I will let you go back to what I'm sure is an extremely busy day. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Aiken.
Amy, it's lovely to talk to you, and thank you very much for moderating the conversation so effectively. And I hope I've answered the good questions that were put to me in a suitably effective manner.
The pleasure was all mine. And I think you've given both me and our audience definitely plenty of food for thought for the rest of the StratCom events. So I will let you go, and thank you to our audience for joining us today at the Atlantic Council for StratCom. And thank you for all of your thoughtful questions. Take care and stay safe.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.